94.3 The Dude is very grateful to our men and women in uniform. We're proud to recognize local members of our military by turning the spotlight on them right now in our Soldier Salute.
I'm your host, Sergeant First Class Retired Don Sorensen, and on today's Soldier Salute, I'm speaking with United States Navy Lieutenant Commander Retired Tom Abrahamsen. Tom, tell me about yourself.
Well, I was born in northern New York State, spent my early life there, moved to Norman, Oklahoma, where my father was going to the University of Oklahoma. So that's my football team. Moved back to northern New York State, lived in Messina, New York for several years, then moved from there to West Virginia, New Martinsville, West Virginia. Moved from there to Marietta, Ohio, and then I started school in Kent, Ohio for my undergraduate degree. Was there during the 1970 shootings. After that, I joined the Navy, went to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, and from there to the USS Little Rock, CLG-4, which is a light guided missile cruiser, no longer in active service. Spent 4 years on board Little Rock, 2 of those in Gaeta, Italy, the others home ported in Newport and Norfolk, Virginia. After leaving Little Rock, I went to the U.S. Navy CB base at Gulfport, Mississippi for 2 years. And after that, I got out of the Navy, although I spent the next 15 years as a reservist. Moved to Johnson City, Tennessee, attended East Tennessee State University for a graduate degree in biology. From there, I started work with Eastman Kodak in Kingsport, Tennessee, an environmental biologist, raising fathead minnows and water fleas for a living because I was doing aquatic toxicity tests. After that, I moved here to Columbia, South Carolina, and worked as a biologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. During that 16-year period, I also was an adjunct instructor at Midlands Technical College, professor in biology. After I retired from USGS in 2010, I got a full-time position at Midlands Tech as a faculty instructor in biology and head of the Biology 101 program. Designed labs and lectures for Biology 101.
Tom, Kent State in the 70s was such a galvanizing time for our country. The incident where the National Guard soldiers fired upon the students is something that I think will always be talked about. And you were there for that. Tell me about that experience.
Started out on, I believe it was a Friday night, with some protests against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. And to my recollection, there were protesters there who were bussed in by some unknown group because there were a lot of people there that were not students. And there was a general rampage downtown. Broken windows, cars being burned. And then that spilled over to the campus the next day. There were crowds massing on the campus, and that night, I think it was a Saturday night, the ROTC building was set afire, and the fire responders were threatened or intimidated by people in the crowd that had gathered to watch. And there was a report that some of the fire hoses were hacked up by machetes. I did not see that, so that's just secondhand information. The next day, there was a general ban on gatherings by students. Classes were not yet suspended, but a lot of us didn't go to class that day. So I was a member of the staff in one of the dormitories, probably about 3 football fields away from where the students were massing for the protests. And we could see the students running over the top of a hill, and I guess they were being herded by the National Guard. Couldn't see the National Guard, but I was standing there with several friends in front of the Tri-Towers, and we heard a single shot. And we all turned to each other and said, "Wow, somebody just fired a gun." And then there was a volley. So whether somebody fired at the troopers and caused them to respond, but to this day, it was my recollection that we thought somebody fired at troopers. And the Guard were mostly college students in the Guard Reserve who had been fired at by people during the trucker strike in Cleveland. Never heard any reports of that single shot being fired, but I recall it distinctly. As a member of the staff of Tri-Towers, I was going through the building, and about the 3rd floor of Tri-Towers, one of the guardsmen's bullets had gone through the window and lodged in the wall. And we dug it out of the wall and gave it to the FBI. So,
Tom, I noticed a Navy Seabee sticker on your truck. The Fighting Seabees was one of my favorite movies. You didn't go directly in as a Navy Seabee. You had kind of a journey in the Navy, didn't you?
I did. I started out in Newport, Rhode Island as a supply officer on board USS Little Rock, CLG-4, which was a guided missile cruiser. Spent some time in Newport, gallivanting around the North Atlantic, and then over to Gaeta, Italy, where we were home ported as flagship of the 6th Fleet. So Gaeta was on the west coast of Italy, about midway between Rome and Naples. So we had a pretty nice time. We spent most of that time floating around the Mediterranean, especially the eastern Mediterranean, during the 6-day Arab-Israeli War, and sometime during the early 70s, 72, 73, whenever that was. While we were in the Mediterranean, of course, the Russians were very active with us and always had trawlers following the fleet. And since we were flagship of the 6th Fleet, they were very interested in everything we did. So we were in concert with several other ships, including a couple of carriers. And I noticed one day when I was standing on the fantail, there was a Russian trawler that was getting too close to us. And I mentioned it to some fellow shipmates, and we all stood there looking at this trawler. And suddenly a Phantom, 2 of them actually, flew over the trawler about 50 feet above the trawler, going Mach 1+. And a sonic boom made the mast of the trawler quiver. We could actually see it quiver back and forth. And the trawler turned around and went the other way. And we figured the admiral just got tired of having the Russians there. And also, that's the time when the U.S. ambassador to Cyprus was assassinated. So we were out there for that reason, too. So I spent about 4 years on board Little Rock, left Little Rock while I was in Gaeta, Italy, and went to Gulfport, Mississippi, became a supply officer for the Seabees. Spent 2 years in Gulfport as supply officer, and then took an honorable discharge out of the regular service into the reserves.
Tom, being a member of a tailhook squadron in the United States Marine Corps, I'm kind of familiar with shellbacks and polywogs, and I was going to ask you about that, but I heard something today I'm not familiar with, and that's a blue nose. Tell me how you become a blue nose.
Well, like in shellbacks and polywogs, you have to cross a specific part of the Earth, which is the equator, but for a blue nose, you have to cross the Arctic Circle. So we went north of the Arctic Circle on a joint exercise with the Norwegian Navy, and all of us who crossed the Arctic Circle were given this blue nose designation. I have a very nice handwritten certificate hanging on my wall, which designates me as a blue nose. So,
is that a King Neptune thing as well, or?
No, there was really no real ceremony for it. It's just something to say officially that I've been north of the Arctic Circle. Tom,
in the Navy, you were a supply officer. How do you go from there to being a biologist at Eastman Kodak?
Well, one of the reasons I joined the Navy was to try to get into the Naval Research, Office of Naval Research in biology and oceanography. But it didn't work out, so I got into supply. Of course, that was my third choice. Being colorblind, I couldn't drive a ship or fly a plane, which were my first two choices. So joined the Navy as a supply corps officer, and then when I got out as a biologist, I was looking for a job in aquatic biology, because that's my primary love, critters in the water. So I joined Eastman Kodak as their environmental biologist, and I raised fathead minnows and water fleas for a living, because they are the white rats of aquatic toxicity testing. Use those to determine whether the water that the company puts back in the river is clean enough. And there's a national code, it's called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES. And there are requirements in that code for making sure that the water that you put back in is safe for the critters. So these two organisms, the fathead minnows and the water fleas, are indicator organisms. If they survive well in the water that you put back into the river, then they figure the rest of the river is fine. So they're very stringent, and the companies have to pay a lot of money to make sure that they are not including pollutants back into the river.
Tom, when I retired from the National Guard as a full-time marketing professional, I became a student at Midlands Tech, and one of the things that drove me crazy was the lack of discipline that so many of these students had. How did you, with your military background, handle that as an instructor?
Well, that's an excellent question. I dealt with many different personality types as a supply officer in the Navy, especially as a food service officer, because I had people serving food to the crew, 68 of them. There was always a problem. There was always disciplinary problems or activity problems. So the ability to deal with those served me well as an instructor. The students at Midlands Tech, by and large, are excellent students. But there are those who, one, do not know how to read or will not read, have no ability to manage their time and have a social life that they will not give up. So how did I deal with that? I tried a variety of things. I put crossword puzzles into the homework assignments. I added chapter quizzes, oral chapter quizzes at the end of every chapter after we went through them in lecture. All right, among the students, my best students, almost all of them were ex-military. In fact, I had one student, probably the best student I ever had, was a former chief of the boat on a nuclear submarine. So the ex-military people, they knew what they were doing, they were disciplined, they had the drive, they had the burning desire to improve their lives.
Tom, you're my neighbor, man, but I had no clue how fascinating you really are. You've had such a great life. Navy, professor, Eastman Kodak, USGS, or United States Geological Survey. But I tell you, what first got me talking to you is walking past your house and hearing the sound of that saw coming from your wood shop. Tell me about life after retirement.
Well, in 2017, when I was thinking of retiring, finally, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just had no clue that I'd be interested in woodworking, and somehow the bug bit me, and I used some of my retirement funds to build a wood shop because I was really, really into it. So I have this nice little 24 by 16 shop next to my house, and I'm learning new stuff every day. And it's amazing how working with wood stimulates your mind, because you have to figure out angles and cuts and lengths and measurements, and you have to do that constantly. And you always have to be aware of safety. That's extremely important. So you got to be on the stick, and that's what is keeping me going in retirement. I love woodworking.
Thanks for joining us in our Soldier Salute, presented by Little Pig's Barbecue, serving Columbia since 1963 with that bodacious buffet, and by Lexington Guns and Shooting Range, veteran owned and operated.